All right, well, shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about the future on this podcast. Let's talk about the past. This week, Cody, you and one of your colleagues kind of combined for a look back at the 2003 Detroit Tigers, a team that, like, I was 10 years old at the time. So that's like the first team that I can remember, I remember Mike Maroth. I remember like him refusing to come out of like missed starts or whatever. I remember Dimitri Young and like always hitting home runs with him in MVP baseball. He's one of my favorites. I remember a lot of the guys from that team really well, and it's because it was like the first team that I really followed, and
Mhm.
and it got really interesting at the end there, and you chronicled this very well in the story. And then also like the legacy aspect of it with Trammell and Gibby being on the bench, and my dad, he was living in California during the '84 World Series and all that stuff, so like he feels, although the '68 team's number one for him, he does feel like a kind of special connection because he was in the region for their second World Series of his lifetime. So, like the reverence that he has for those guys, like it brought back a flood of early memories. Some of the first ones where I kind of remember thinking like clearly, if that makes sense. I feel like you're about that age where you start kind of choosing things a little bit
Yeah.
more, and so it was a fun walk down memory. And I wonder if you could just kind of take us through like the reporting of that story, and if there's a reason beyond the 20th anniversary, feeling old, of that team. If you had any memories of that run at the time, for you growing up in the great city of Amarillo, Texas, and anything you learned, because it works out that you got access to AJ Hinch, who was on that team, and all that stuff. So, as pitiful of that team was, just bottom line, it was kind of like a feel good. It was a feel good story in many ways. It was awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think 20th anniversary is the reason Stephen Nesbitt and I wrote this story. But since the day I started covering the Tigers, it is a team I think with such a fascinating legacy because you hear about it all the time. You're Craig Monroe, who I talked to for this story, he talks about it on the broadcast all the time. 2003 was terrible, but this was a long year. But Alan Trammell talks about in 2003 went through all this, but the guys who stuck around learned a lot from that year. And 3 years later, of course, they were in the World Series. And even the guys that didn't stick around, it is interesting because the year had this positive ending where they win 5 out of 6 games, where they come back and win on a strikeout wild pitch to avoid breaking the record for most losses in the season, and they dogpile. The only 110 plus loss team to ever dogpile on the second to last day of the season, as far as I know. So I think that makes it fascinating. It was really fun talking to people and putting this story together. Really interesting hearing how you're talking to guys who lost 119 games, and everyone seems to look back on it with like a certain level of fondness. Yeah, it was hard. Yeah, I did learn a lot about just the amount of early work and pregame stuff they did. AJ Hinch said it was almost like instructional league. Kurt Gibson was like, some of these guys should have been in Lakeland. And I think that was the other thing, was something I hadn't really considered, was like Trammell and Gibby and Lance Parrish. You had these winners, these champions who were on this coaching staff. And it must have been kind of crazy to see them in a losing environment like that. And I liked what Craig Monroe said. He said, that was kind of a point of pride, and you didn't want to feel like you were letting them down. And especially that last week, that was an extra motivator. He said, guy's name is on the effing wall. Like you wanted to win for them. So it was clear the players had a lot of respect for Tram and Gibby. It's obviously unfortunate that Alan Trammell's managerial career kind of was what it was. The guy had no talent to work with, and that was that. Kind of sucks looking back, and I think it probably hurts Tram a little more than he'd let on for such a positive guy. I think he obviously wishes things had been a little different in his time as a manager, but I think all these things also work out for the best. Like, I think the role Tram is in right now is probably perfect for him, where he just gets to go around and work with young guys. So those were all interesting things in terms of growing up. Like I remember it too as a TBS Braves fan. I had a much happier childhood. 01, 02, 03 Braves were probably the teams I have the most emotional attachment to, and the much better teams than your 03 Tigers, Kieran. But I remember, it was a national storyline. Like I remember, are they going to be the worst team ever? And that was something that kind of made you tune in. And I do remember loosely kind of following it down the stretch and being like, oh, I wonder if the Tigers will be the worst ever. And sure enough, they weren't.
Well, a couple weeks ago, I referenced, I still have here in my office to my right, a hat. Well, Mike Maroth is on that hat, along with Kenny Rogers, because he was still on that '06 team, and then he at least at the beginning, and I think, I don't remember what the actual transaction was. I should have looked this up, but he was like not on the roster. I don't think he was on the playoff roster, but he still like traveled, because I remember him being like in the dugout and like all that stuff. And I remember like really being happy for him in '06, and Craig Monroe the same way, and Brandon Inge, went through a position change, and all this stuff. Like that was a team, like you can very much credit the '06 run to some of the stuff that they experienced in '03. And I love Dan Dickerson's call of Maglio's home run to send them to the World Series in '06. And he says, I'm going to paraphrase here, one of the most remarkable turnarounds in American League history. And it's true. And Trammell leaves after '05, '06, they go to the World Series, or not leaves, he gets fired, obviously. But like, they go to the World Series. And I think in Pudge's autobiography, like he talked about some of that too. Now he wasn't on the '03 team, of course, but he talked about the impact Trammell had as a manager. And at the time, Trammell was on the Hall of Fame, and it was also kind of partially a, Trammell ought to be in the Hall of Fame thing or whatever. And so like the impact went way beyond the win-loss for that team. And as I'm going through the story and kind of remembering things myself, a couple of thoughts came to my mind. One of them was, whew, man. Sometimes, like the past couple of years, I felt bad for, some of the TV people, like the desk people and Dan, like not to say like they don't enjoy their job or whatever, but obviously it's not as fun to cover a team that is showing nothing, right? And Dan and Jim Price, that was very early in their careers.
That was Dan's first full season taking over for Ernie Harwell.
First full season, yeah.
Here you go, Dan.
And they had, and it was their first time without the legend, and they referenced it a little bit this year at random times, So I was like, that's so you want to be a Major League Baseball play-by-play guy, And another thing that kind of struck me is, because we live it day to day, we don't just feel the need to kind of like talk about it and say it out loud. But this was another example of what a great kind of baseball family Detroit is in regards to the fans and the people in the organization, even ones that haven't kind of been around all that long. Like there's a million scenarios where the legendary player that won a World Series comes to be the manager, and the win-loss record stinks. And something happens either with the fans or with the front office, ownership, whatever, where you more or less have severed ties with the organization if you're that player. And obviously that's not Trammell. Like Trammell is, because of the emotions displayed in the story, which you're an Athletic subscriber, you can read, is, I would say that's even more endearing to Tigers fans that he was the manager for that team, and you see like the Craig Monroe quote that you just put, his name's on the effing wall, like the respect they had for him. And so like, that was just another example. Even Kirk Gibson, I know it was different ownership, but like he left that and I know he came back later in his career, I know all these things, but like he left the organization under really bad circumstances before he became a icon to baseball in general in 1988. So like, it's just another example of the Tigers family. Kind of made me feel warm, like all these guys are still around. Lance Parrish, Petrie, like Craig Monroe, that's like the next wave, you know what I mean? Cameron, all these guys have kind of come in this year. Todd Jones on the '06 team. AJ Hinch is a guy who left and came back, like it just kind of made me feel like, man, this is actually kind of like the Detroit Tigers family. It's pretty loving. It's pretty broad. and it kind of, I think, reflects the city a little bit, to be honest. Like I always separate myself from someone who, grew up in Detroit and experienced some of the city hardships and all that stuff. But the ethos are ones I try to follow and respect to the highest, and it just kind of seems to me like a reflection of all of that. And so I thought it was an awesome story. It brought me back down to memory lane, and it also made me feel appreciative of some of the teams we've had the past couple of years, because those guys didn't have a Riley Green to look forward to. They didn't have a Spencer Torkelson to look forward to per se. Like so it was really fun to read, and really glad that you went ahead and reported on that story.